The days in the prisoner of war camp were like one another. Most of the misbehaviors committed by the prisoners were minor offenses that did not amount to such a public spectacle as the execution by hanging we had witnessed a few weeks before. The offenses were mostly cases of petty theft or indiscipline, but even these could quickly become a big problem. This was especially true in cases of food theft. One such incident occurred when 3 platoons of our company were ordered to go 2 kilometers to the nearest village bakery to get bread for the camp. On their return, after checking the food, it turned out that some of it had been lost through the fault of the soldiers. After a short investigation, we suspected that 2 soldiers of my platoon had stolen 6 kilograms of bread, but could not prove anything. As a result, the whole company suffered because later, when we were given bread, we received 6 kilograms less than we were supposed to. This caused discontent. The lieutenant reported the incident to Captain Tarakanov, who immediately sent for those 2 soldiers. They stubbornly denied everything, and in the end, he had to irritably let them go. The captain was not particularly worried about the incident. He himself was not hurt, and he did not care. As it seemed to us, everything was resolved, and the soldiers finally calmed down. Later that evening, I sat with the captain and the lieutenant. Shortly after 9, we heard a terrible scream coming from a room at the end of the corridor. I jumped up and ran there. The door to the room was open, and I realized that the scream came from there. When I approached the room, a prisoner covered with blood jumped out of it right into my hands. Tarakanov and I took him to our room. We recognized him as a lieutenant who had filed a report accusing 2 soldiers of stealing bread. He had been attacked in his sleep and beaten with his own boots so badly that his face turned into a bloody mask. Tarakanov was furious, as now he would have to report all this to the camp administration. The NKVD immediately sent 3 soldiers to our barracks, who immediately took all 3 men from there, the beaten lieutenant and the 2 suspects in the theft. The punishment of the camp administration was lightning fast and severe. For the next 25 days, these men were deprived of 200 grams of bread and half a portion of soup. So every day spent in the camp caused negative emotions, depressed me mentally. After all, I myself was a prisoner here. Only my imprisonment was more comfortable than that of the poor people I had to guard. I tried very hard to put on a mask of aloofness and indifference. I did not want to bring other people close to me, lest I show them my true face. I never looked people in the eye. I avoided company. I didn't smile. It became second nature to me, and I worried that as a result of all this effort, I as a person would forever lose my true self. In addition, to dull the anxiety and pain of the death and despair around me, I tried to work even harder. I realized that eventually all this hopelessness and poverty would make me callous, and I would stop paying attention to it. I didn't get to that point, at least not yet, but it was all starting to wear me out. I managed to find moments when I could distract myself with something pleasant or funny, when I could laugh at something myself. I remember when one of our platoon was sent to work. I was with Tarakanov in his room. The platoon commander came into the room and interrupted our conversation. "Comrade Captain, one senior lieutenant refuses to go to work." Tarakanov brought his hand to his face and slowly rubbed his eyes. Then he lowered his hand again and looked at the platoon commander as if he had been asked to settle a dispute between 4-year-old children. "All right, send him over here." The platoon commander left, and a minute later the officer in question entered the room. Tarakanov spoke to him in his most normal voice. "Why don't you want to work today?" "I am ready to work," replied the officer, "but I have no gloves." "And where are your gloves, Lieutenant?" The officer simple-mindedly replied, "I use them to keep some bread I have saved up there. I don't want others to know about it." After these words, Tarakanov laughed deafeningly. I had never seen him laugh like that. Even the officer was unable to contain his surprise at having managed to bring his commander to enjoy this comedy scene. When the captain managed to catch his breath, he struggled to squeeze out, "Get out of here." Even I had to laugh. Later that evening, another food incident occurred. For dinner, each company received its portion of soup in a large tank. Lieutenant Anishchenko was in charge of the distribution and distributed the bread and soup. The kitchen was usually generous in giving out soup, and we usually got 15 to 20 servings more than we were supposed to. There were 300 men in the company, and everyone wanted that extra portion to go to him. When the soup distribution was finished, a whole horde of hunters for that extra portion would usually gather around him. They all crowded around, pushing and shoving each other, dipping their spoons in there until finally someone accidentally pushed the tank. The tank overturned with its contents. The soldiers would fall silent and stand frustrated over the lost food. As for me, I always laughed about it. I thought to myself that in Germany such a thing could simply never happen and order and discipline would reign in the camp. Finally, after only a few days, the funniest incident happened. This time, you might say, I was the author of the joke, and it almost cost me my life. May 1 was approaching, which was considered a special holiday in Russia. The whole camp was feverishly preparing for the holiday, including a demonstration and a parade for the camp administration. Several companies were to take part in the parade, including my company. The day was to begin with athletic contests and games. Immediately afterward, an NKVD colonel from Moscow was to arrive and was assigned to lead the official event. He arrived in advance to take part in the rehearsals we had held on the eve of the holiday. Everyone realized that the officers of the camp took it all very seriously, perhaps hoping to impress their command in Moscow. And so the colonel announced the start of the parade and led it himself. He was followed by a whole crowd of people, including someone in German uniform. He was trying to look like Adolf Hitler. He portrayed that he was trying to escape from Russian lands on horseback. Immediately following Hitler was the German army. It was represented by a group of soldiers dressed in German uniforms. Some were wearing real German tunics, others were wearing boots, and they all had their ears plugged. When I saw that group, I thought about the fate of those soldiers who had been stripped of those uniforms. Maybe those uniforms were worn by comrades from my battalion, but I didn't have time to think about it long enough to avoid being seen by any of the bystanders. Everyone around me was having fun, glad for the opportunity to get away from the horrors of imprisonment. Spring had arrived, and the weather was getting warmer and warmer. The news from the front that reached the camp gave hope that the Russian army would indeed drive back the German troops. Everyone was in a high, almost happy mood, but not me. People were laughing loudly at the pre-rehearsed tricks and jokes. Some of the imaginary Germans were using stilts in an attempt to escape from the camp. They zigzagged left and right, depicting Hitler's pursuit of his horse on which he had fled Russia. The parade was continued by another group of people who followed right behind the dumb Germans. This group portrayed the Russian people driving the German army away. They waved their fists and shouted at the Germans in front as they passed the grandstand. After the staging, our company marched in parade formation. I had to lead the parade company march. We took the assignment very seriously and began preparing for the parade 14 days before the appointed date. Tarakhanov was determined to play a majestic performance in front of his superiors. May 1 came, and it was time to start the festivities. Everything went as we had planned, and it was evident that the camp authorities on the podium were pleased with the performance. Everyone was laughing at the German army. They were cheering the Russian people with bunting and yells as they chased her away. At last, it was time for our company to march. Captain Tarakhanov had reminded me several times during the last 2 weeks that it was my duty to lead it well. We all got into formation, and I have to admit I was pretty nervous. I had been trying so hard for the last few months to remain inconspicuous, and now at some point I was to participate in a performance to become the center of attention of the entire camp and the NKVD officers. That was the last thing I wanted to do, but I felt I owed a great debt to Tarakhanov. This performance was important to him, and he was counting on me. The reason for what happened next became a mystery to me for many years. I think that some part of me was somehow driven into my subconscious, and I was overcome by instincts acquired over years of training. I started marching, trying to give out my best step for the captain when my foot goes belt level. After a few steps, I realized what I was doing and nearly fell dead, stopping. My God, what had I done? Had I given away my German identity with this goose step in front of a crowd of Russian officers? The whole camp was looking at me. What should I do? Further on, things were even worse. I turned back and saw how my whole company, following the one in front, followed me with the same goose step right in front of the tribune, from which the NKVD officers were watching the spectacle in wild amazement. I could no longer stop, as that would have looked deliberate. I tried not to look at the officers as we walked past them. All I wanted was for this to be over soon so I could hide somewhere. The march lasted only a few minutes, but it seemed like hours. People were laughing as they looked at me, saying something to each other. I was convinced that I had already guaranteed myself a place in front of the firing squad. My heart was pounding frantically. I was drenched in sweat, but I could not allow anyone to notice that all this had not been done by accident. To my utter astonishment, there was no catastrophe. On the contrary, Tarakanov was very proud of the way we had marched. When the parade was over, I stopped and the soldiers around me broke formation and dispersed. They were laughing and talking to each other. Many came up to me, clapped me on the back, and thanked me for such a fine performance. I smiled back, but I was still in shock. When I looked for Tarakanov, I found him going to the podium to talk to the colonel. Later, he told me that the NKVD officers called him to ask about the man who had organized such a beautiful march in formation. Tarakanov replied that it was a Polish senior lieutenant. It was evident that the colonel liked the march. After a short conversation, Tarakanov looked in our direction and ordered everyone who had participated in the parade march to gather together. Then he pointed at me and gestured for me to come up. I made my way through the crowd, and as I approached the captain, he put a hand on my shoulder. I have just been talking to the colonel. He liked our march so much he'd like to see it again. Take the men back to their original position. I just stared at him intently and couldn't think of anything to say in response. I turned to the soldiers, and together we quickly walked back to the starting position where we formed up for the reenactment. From afar, I saw Tarakanov talking about something with the other officers on the podium. I kept him in sight, waiting for the signal to pass. When he waved to me, I took a deep breath and began my march again with the raising of my leg to the level of the belt. I could hear the clatter of soles behind me and the sounds of laughter, but this time I didn't dare look back. The officers applauded as we passed, and I politely saluted Tarakanov with a nod of my head. He was obviously proud of me. I, however, was still in disbelief at what was happening around me. We passed the podium for the second time, and this time the formation scattered even faster. I tried to blend in with a group of my soldiers to hide from view, but one of the colonels shouted my name. I looked back, and he waved at me as a sign that he wanted to talk to me. I ran up to him and saluted. "That was quite a performance you put on today. Your commander told me that you filed a report that you want to return to the Polish army. Is that true?" "Yes, it is." "Well, I'd like you to consider joining the Russian army instead. It would be much better than serving in the Polish army. We can offer you so much more." I could hardly believe that this was actually happening. "I don't care whether I serve in the Russian army or the Polish army." After that, his mood changed dramatically, and he decided not to waste any more time with me. He waved me off, then turned around and went to the other officers. I realized I was free to go. In turn, I turned around and tried to maximize the distance between me and those officers. Later that evening, I learned from Captain Tarakanov that he had been summoned a second time by the colonel to try again to persuade me to join the Russian army. On my return, the captain suggested that I pay the colonel a visit again. The captain was doing this for me, but I declined. It was just a casual episode, and I did not wish it to continue. I wished to leave that incident in the past as far as possible. That same month, a new officer arrived at the camp in the 9th Company. His name was Joseph Malinowski, and he was a Pole said to be from Lemberg. Captain Tarakanov was eager to introduce us to each other, apparently assuming on a voluntary basis the role of being responsible for bringing together all the Polish citizens of the camp. I talked to Malinowski, and he confessed to me that he had been a senior doctor in the German army for some time. The Russians captured him in Odessa and put him in prison. While he was imprisoned, the Russians began to use his art to treat the civilian population of the city who had been wounded in the fighting. All the while, he claimed that he was actually an officer in the Polish army. Eventually, the Russians decided that they no longer needed him or that there was too great a risk that he would escape, so they handed him over to an NKVD camp. Now, there were 3 Polish officers in the camp, including Bruno. In time, we learned that we were the only Poles for the 15,000 people held in the camp. All the others were Russians. I was surrounded by enemies, and the only thing that kept me from execution was that my identity was not revealed, and I didn't know how long this protection would save me. Everything inside me was telling me to leave this place. It had been many weeks since I had submitted my official report for transfer to the Polish army. I felt it was time to make another attempt. One evening, Bruno, the doctor, and I gathered in a secluded spot within the camp, and I announced to them that we needed to find a way to get out of here. As a group, we went to one of the camp commanders and handed him an official report for transfer out of the camp to a place where we could serve in the Polish army. The officer took the report apparently indifferently and ordered us to wait for a reply. A week later, the answer came, but it was not at all what we had hoped for. I was summoned to an NKVD major, who stated that collective reports were not considered. We had to submit the same report in writing again, each of us individually. With that, the major let me go. I passed on his words to Bruno and the doctor, and we did as he advised. Then we waited again. And 4 days later, something unusual happened. The doctor disappeared. I learned that he, along with 2,000 other prisoners, had been sent to the stage. The word stage meant forced labor in the cabbage fields about 80 kilometers from Stalino. I never saw him again. Now there were only 2 Poles left in the camp, and after a few more days, I began to think that the last report, like the previous one, would do nothing. But I was wrong. One evening on the camp grounds, Tarakanov found me and ordered me to go to one of the NKVD camp officers. He told me to take Bruno with me. This order gave me a bad feeling. Of course, it concerned our request, and all it could mean was that there was news for the 2 of us. But no one could be sure how the conversation with the NKVD would end. Together, we approached the officer and worriedly stood at attention, waiting for the reason for the summons to be explained to us. I was relieved to learn that our transfer report had been satisfied. I tried to contain my feelings, keeping them deep inside, so that no one would know that for me it meant not a simple desire to continue fighting, but another step towards freedom. Our assignment was not exactly what I had hoped for, but it meant a step in the right direction. We were ordered to report to a camp where German captured soldiers were held. This camp was located 18 kilometers east of Stalino and was known as the first branch of Camp No. 280. At 11 a.m. we, accompanied by 1 officer and 4 soldiers, set out on foot from Camp No. 240. When the gate swung open in front of us, I grinned with all my mouth. I realized that I was still not free, but for a moment it seemed to me that this was the case. The day was beautiful, and it felt good to be out in the wild. For the first time, I took a good look at my surroundings, and Russia no longer seemed such a terrible place. From time to time, Bruno and I exchanged smiles without saying a word to each other. It was already quite dark by the time we arrived. It was about 22 o'clock hours on the clock. I was waiting to meet the German soldiers, hoping to be among my own people again. Representatives of the camp administration met us at the gate and escorted us inside. The officer who had accompanied us from the former camp gave the guard an order to take care of the 2 Polish officers who had arrived. When we entered the administration building, we were warmly welcomed by the camp administration. We were immediately taken to the doctor for examination. The doctor ordered us both to undress. The doctor did not examine us very carefully, as he was immediately convinced that we had managed to preserve our strength. Having finished the paperwork, the doctor gave us the completed documents, and the sentry took us to the camp commander. He took us to the barracks, where another escort was already waiting for us. The soldier saluted the chief and left. And then I heard speech in my native German for the first time in what seemed to me an eternity. The speech was coming from a neighboring room. Tears came to my eyes. For a second, I thought I was home. The chief took us to a small room where there were 2 bunks. He handed us 2 blankets and said that in the morning he would familiarize us with our duties and other necessary information. After a long walk to Camp No. 280, we were very tired and were glad to lie down. At 8 a.m. the next day, a Russian officer came by and took us to the mess hall. To the staff in the kitchen, he introduced us as two Polish officers and ordered that we be fed according to the officer's standard. This meant 300 grams of white and the same amount of black bread, 25 grams of sugar, and 30 grams of butter each day. We walked with the officer to the place where the prisoners of war were fed and sat down among them. There I met the German lieutenant and non-commissioned officer who headed the German camp administration. The lieutenant's surname was Bonner, and the non-commissioned officer, who was from Nuremberg, was called Taps. The lieutenant took us with him and introduced us to the German, Romanian, and Hungarian officers. In all, there were 18 Germans, 6 Romanian, and 11 Hungarian officers. Then we were told that 2 groups of Poles were also held here, whom we also met. All the Poles greeted us joyfully. The news of the arrival of the 2 Polish officers immediately spread in the camp. We were told that Poland had already been liberated, and now the Polish army was fighting against the Germans together with the Russian troops. I realized that coming here was not such a smart idea. In fact, my position could now become even more uncertain. I had managed to fool the Russians into believing that I was a Pole and not a German soldier, but it would be much more difficult to fool the Germans and the Poles. I realized that here I needed to behave even more circumspectly so that no one would suspect me of being a German. Besides, I feared that I would meet someone here whom I knew personally, and that would mean the end of my whole charade. For some time to come, I would have to continue living in an environment of deception. On the second day, some pompous man in a Russian military uniform came to see me. It was quite late, and Bruno and I were lying on our bunks resting after the day's troubles. When he entered the room, I jumped to my feet, saluted, and shouted clearly in Russian. 2 Russian officers are being held here. But the man addressed me in German. He asked if I spoke the language, and I answered in the affirmative. He ordered me to go with him to the 5th barrack and asked where he could see the camp instructor. I told him to follow me. I led him to the administration building where we found the instructor, who would more properly be called the camp propagandist. In a commanding voice, which was impossible not to obey, he asked us both to go with him to his office. Without asking anything, we followed him into the building where he lived. The meeting was not eventful, as we were asked the simplest questions about the number of camp personnel, its composition, the number of prisoners of war, and their organizational structure. Leaving his company, I sought out Lieutenant Bonner and asked him about who the man was. He told me that he was a German communist who had fled to Russia in 1933 after the Nazis came to power. He was originally from the Saarland region. The Russians used his services when they needed to make anti-fascist speeches to prisoners of war. I was soon ordered to report to the instructor, and I obeyed at once. I had a very strange feeling in the presence of this man, and I felt a certain awkwardness about my position here. I stood in the doorway of his office and waited for him to pay attention to me. The instructor was sitting at his desk, absorbed in a document that lay on the table in front of him. Looking up, he motioned for me to sit down in front of his desk. I sat down and he, clearing a space on the desk in front of him, pulled out a new notebook. The instructor asked for my first and last name, which he carefully wrote down. He then asked about my rank and the duties I had performed in the Polish army. After I answered, he noticed that I spoke German very well. Since there were so many Germans around me here, I did not particularly try to hide it. I replied that I had studied German at school. He asked me if I also spoke English and French, and I said that I did. I calmly told him all of this because he had confessed to me earlier that he had previously been only a locksmith's helper. There was no way he could speak English or French, and therefore he could not test me here. Then the instructor asked if I would be willing to answer a few questions regarding politics. I answered, I have never been and will never be interested in politics. One thing is clear to me. A soldier can never become a politician, nor can a politician become a soldier. He looked at me with a blank stare, then ducked into his notebook and wrote down my answer verbatim. His last question was if I was Hitler's brother. I answered, as I understand it, you always hit the sweet spot when identifying someone. He wrote something down in his notebook again, then thanked me and asked me to send my comrade here. I went back to the barracks, found Bruno, and told him to go to the instructor. He asked what the talk would be about, but I didn't know what to tell him. Bruno went out but returned about 20 minutes later. He recounted his conversation, which seemed a bit more lively than my conversation with the instructor. I had hoped that this camp would be different, but it loomed that it was not much different. Fortunately, arriving here, we both already knew how the NKVD worked. Everything could start with an instructor and end up in the NKVD. The next morning, a senior NKVD lieutenant came to our barracks. The conversation from the beginning was almost pleasant. He asked us how we were settling in, whether we liked our surroundings. He did not speak Polish very well, so he asked if Bruno and I understood Russian. When we answered in the affirmative, he breathed a sigh of relief. Turning to me, the senior lieutenant asked me what specific position I held in the Polish army. I evaded a direct answer and stated only that I was a lieutenant and Bruno was a warrant officer. Then he asked if we had ever served in the German army. We replied that we had not, that we had only worked briefly in German construction crews. He continued to question us about our military background, but occasionally asked again if we were German officers. Finally, he fell behind us, said goodbye, and clearly dissatisfied, left the room. The last conversation left me with a very unpleasant residue. I told Bruno that we should behave very carefully here. We should ask around to see if there were other people from the same place as us who could identify us. He agreed, and we both began to walk around the camp, hanging around among the prisoners, trying to find out more about who had come here and where they had come from. That same evening, Bruno brought me news. He announced, "There's another man here from my hometown. I haven't talked to him yet. He works at the warehouse. Let's go there together right now." We immediately found that man, a Pole from the town of Grudziec near Gansk. We asked what street he lived on, and by a strange coincidence, he was from the same street Bruno lived on. We had some doubts about his answer, and we began to persistently ask him again. I asked him if he lived on the same street as someone named Schmedzielski. He replied that yes, there was such a person, but that he had settled in Germany many years ago. Bruno realized that he was talking about his cousin. He said that his brother lived there too, but on the next street. That might have been the only way Bruno could escape. Then we focused on identifying anyone who might live in the same neighborhood as me. Over the next few days, we wandered around the camp and randomly asked soldiers where they were from. I was lucky, and in all the time I spent in the camp, I didn't meet anyone who might have known me. I also tried to stay away from the building that housed the camp administration. This camp was very similar to Camp No. 240. Both were hastily built on a vast area of what had once been farmland. Roughly built barracks were surrounded by numerous rows of barbed wire. But there seemed to be more order in this camp, and this was no doubt due to the presence of so many Germans who were much more disciplined than the Russians. The signal to rise sounded at 5 a.m., and at 5:30 we were already outside for inspection. Breakfast was served at 6 a.m. sharp. Everyone was entitled to a liter of soup. The soup was liquid, rare grains were barely floating in it. There were also 200 grams of bread, which after weighing in the Russian manner turned into only 80 grams. If a work brigade fulfilled the daily norm, a person received an additional 200 grams of bread. At lunch they received another 200 grams of bread and another liter of soup, as well as 50 grams of fish, sea perch. After cooking, the fish was cut into thin slices and poured with sunflower oil. For dinner, the prisoners received the same 200 grams of bread, a small cup of coffee, and 100 grams of another fish, somewhat smaller. At 12 o'clock noon, a break was taken, during which a new work assignment was given. Those who could not go to work stayed in the barracks and were examined by the medics. The work crews would return back at 18 o'clock after a long day's work. Then it was their turn to have dinner. At 22 o'clock, the curfew was signaled. A guard was assigned to each barracks. If someone had to go out during the night, the guard had to make sure they came back. Once a month, each prisoner was examined by a doctor who made sure that the men maintained their strength. Prisoners were sorted according to their physical condition and health. Those who fell into the first category worked in the factory loading heavy 100-kilogram bombs to be sent to the front. Each had to load 107 pieces in 8 working hours. Each bomb had to be carried to a distance of 50 to 120 meters. The second category was made up of those who, for some reason, could not get into the first category because they were not in good health. They also worked at the factory and carried 50-kilogram shells. For 8 hours, it was supposed to load 150 shells per person. If a work team fulfilled the norm, it was given an additional bread ration. The third category included even physically weaker people. They did cleaning at the factory, kept records, and maintained order. In addition, people who had been rehabilitated after the fourth category were assigned here. They were assigned only light cleaning work in duty in the camp. The last group to go was what we called the Schlapp team. These people were so broken and exhausted that any attempt to return to higher categories for them ended with them going back after 3 weeks because the work was too hard for them and there was little or no care for them. The laborers lived in difficult conditions. At night, they slept on bare wooden planks. In winter, the barracks were heated by a stove with 1 piece of coal per prisoner. The workers were not given blankets, and their own overcoats served as blankets at night. If someone fell ill and could not work, but did not have a doctor's certificate, he was given 3 days in prison. Such were the harsh orders established by the administration in the first branch of Camp No. 280. One evening I had a conversation with Lieutenant Boner. The conversation was pleasant until he suddenly told me that even if I was a Polish officer, I must have served in the German army for some time. I replied in a carefree tone that I had never been in the Polish army. He threw a stony look at me, abruptly cut short our conversation, and ran to report it immediately. I realized that I was in serious trouble. I went to my bunk to come up with a version that would be good enough to help me get out of this story. That same night at about 2 o'clock, I was awakened by a convoyman who demanded that I go immediately to the administration building. When I got there, an NKVD officer was already waiting for me. He immediately took me to his office and pointed to a small table on which a piece of paper and a pencil were already lying. I sat down on a low chair in front of the desk and waited for instructions. On the piece of paper was written down a list of general questions regarding my background. The officer instructed me to answer them. I generously seeded the document with falsehoods, hoping that I possessed sufficient cunning to continue my deceptive game. I wrote that I attended grammar school, then went to an officer's school in Poland, where I received the rank of ensign. In 1930, I traveled to France, first to Alsace and Lorraine, and then to Metz. There I enrolled in an agricultural school, and in 1933, I received the specialty of agricultural inspector. In the meantime, a woman joined us, also with the rank of NKVD lieutenant, who was apparently assigned to watch me and control the situation. I sat in that office and filled out survey forms until 4 o'clock, after which I was released. I returned to my bunk exhausted and devastated. I was becoming increasingly concerned about the position I was in. As I lay in bed, I tried hard to memorize what I had written, for I knew that I would need my memory if it were necessary to recall any of my stories. It seemed as if the signal to rise had sounded only a minute or two after I had finally fallen asleep again.